I'm pleased to welcome Walter Stahr to Politics and Prose. Mr. Stahr is the author of 2 previous books on American politicians, Seward, Lincoln's Indispensable Man, and John Jay, Founding Father. This time he is tackling Edwin Stanton, President Lincoln's Secretary of War. Lincoln always stood by Stanton, and Stanton remained his right-hand man, even beyond Lincoln's death. When President Johnson wanted to pull Union troops out of the South, Stanton's decision to defy him laid the groundwork for Johnson's impeachment. Stanton's Ron Chernow, author of biographies on Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, declares Walter Stahr has delivered another solid, well-researched biography of a major, if often overlooked, figure in American history. His portrait of Edwin Stanton is fair-minded, rigorous, and scrupulously honest, balancing his sometimes questionable record on civil liberties with the logistical wizardry that he applied to win the Union war effort. Stanton is thus a welcome and significant addition to the ample literature on the Civil War and Reconstruction. Now, please join me in welcoming Walter Stahr.
Thanks so much. It is on. It is wonderful to be back here in Washington where so much of the book takes place and to see so many old friends, long-time friends, sorry, not old, here this evening. What I propose to do this evening is talk about Stanton with a special emphasis on impeachment, because that seems to be a topic of some interest these days. So who was he? Why was he important? Why was he interesting? He was a lawyer who had many cases, including Supreme Court cases, but his most important role was as the Northern Secretary of War during the Civil War. He was Lincoln's military right hand, whom Lincoln referred to in jest as his Mars. His great gift was organization, organizing the War Department, organizing the million-man army, organizing the Northern economy in order to bring all that power to bear to defeat the South. He was also the Secretary of War during the years immediately after the Civil War. And during this period, as we just heard, he and President Andrew Johnson disagreed about Reconstruction policy. Stanton, reading the almost daily reports of murders and other outrages in the South, believed strongly that the Union Army had to remain there. Johnson believed equally strongly that the Union Army should leave, and it was that disagreement which, as I'll get into in more detail, led to the impeachment of Johnson. So, he was important, but why was he interesting? I mean, he was a lawyer. Wasn't he by definition dull? Not long after he died, George Templeton Strong wrote of Stanton that good and evil were strangely blended in the character of this great war minister. He was honest, patriotic, able, indefatigable, warm-hearted, unselfish, incorruptible, arbitrary, capricious, tyrannical, vindictive, hateful, and cruel. I think that Templeton Strong had it about right, that Stanton was all of those things, an odd and difficult mixture of good and evil, and that is what made him such a difficult and fascinating subject to write about, and I hope will make him a fascinating subject to read about. So let's back up a bit and do the basics. Where was he born? Where was he from? What about his family and his career? He was born in Steubenville, Ohio, in December of 1814 on the banks of the Ohio River. His father was a doctor, but his father died when Stanton was quite young. Stanton was only 13 when his father died. There was very little money, so his mother put him to work in a bookstore. So it is fitting that we gather tonight in a bookstore to talk about Stanton. One person remembered that he was a good employee. There was just one minor problem. He was often so wrapped up in reading his book that when you wanted help, you couldn't get his attention. Money was tight, so Stanton only went to college for 3 terms, to Kenyon College in Ohio. He did not graduate. He came home to work in another bookstore, and then he read law to become a lawyer. There were essentially no law schools in those days. To become a lawyer, you read law with a lawyer. His legal career prospered, and also his political career as a Democrat. And I suppose in this bookstore I should say just a word about his political career. He was not, with one exception, a candidate for office. He ran for and won election as county prosecutor. He was more in the back, organizing conventions, going to conventions, writing resolutions, gathering the local Democrats together to discuss who would be their candidate. He did give some speeches. He served kind of as the Ohio point man for his law partner, Benjamin Tappan, who was the United States Senator in the 1830s from Ohio. Politics in those days, I know we think of politics as being really intense these days, but politics was even more intense in those days. You know, the first thing you knew about a person was whether they were a Whig or a Democrat. And if you were a Democrat, you didn't have very many friends who were Whigs, and vice versa. You don't have to get to the editorial page of an 1840s newspaper to know whether this is a Whig paper or a Democratic paper. It's obvious right there in the news coverage. You know, every newspaper is either Whig or Democratic. There are very few neutral newspapers. And every issue of a Whig paper would be lampooning and criticizing and mocking the Democrats. And he was in the thick of that. He loved it. He once wrote, in suggesting a somewhat dubious tactic, well, we cannot expect too much refinement from our opponents. Getting tired of rural Ohio, he moved to Pittsburgh in 1848. Which was at the time not a dying town, but a town whose population was doubling every decade, booming, and quickly becomes a leading lawyer there. His most famous case from this period is the Wheeling Bridge case. The city fathers of Pittsburgh were quite concerned that Wheeling was building a bridge across the Ohio River, and that this would prevent the tall steamboats from coming up the Ohio River to Pittsburgh. So the city persuaded the state to file a lawsuit against the bridge company, and Stanton was the lead lawyer on this lawsuit, which went on for about a decade. So I'm not going to go into all the fine print here, but it's in the book. You know, he takes it back and forth to the Supreme Court several times. The bridge at one point blows down, and so there's a fight about whether it can be rebuilt. The bridge company sneakily goes around the Supreme Court to Congress and gets a law passed declaring the bridge a postal road, and then it goes back to the court saying, well, now it's a postal road, surely it can't be torn down. And in the end, Stanton loses the court case. I mean, he would say, God, the damn bridge is still there. It is still there today. It's a national landmark. But in another sense, he wins because the steamboats manage to continue going up and down the Ohio River. So unlike what people feared, Pittsburgh is not cut off. After several years in Pittsburgh, Stanton remarries. His first wife died young. He remarries to an ambitious daughter of a merchant, and they move here to Washington. He's not here very long before he heads off to California. He's hired by the federal government to handle some land cases in California. So he gets on the boat, goes all the way to California. These cases arise from the confused Mexican land titles, and in particular, he's dealing with a case involving a guy by the name of Limantour who has what seem to be valid claims to half of San Francisco. So this is a big deal. Stanton tackles it by looking at trying to gather all the records he can of all the Mexican land papers from this period to see whether Limantour's papers fit the pattern. And he pretty quickly establishes that they do not fit the pattern. The paper upon which they're printed is a purportedly official paper, but he finds correspondence saying there is no paper in California, send us paper. And the seal looks very like the seal, but if you look at it quite closely, it's just a little bit different from the seal on all the other papers. So through this kind of careful attention to detail, Stanton prevails in the Limantour case and in another important case in California. He comes back to Washington in early 1859, just in time for another great case, the Sickles murder trial. Congressman Daniel Sickles, some people are nodding their heads. This is a great story that people should know more. Congressman Daniel Sickles, in broad daylight, shoots and kills the son of Francis Scott Key in Lafayette Square. Right? There is no question that he shot and killed him. There are dozens of witnesses to the shooting. But there is a defense, which is, this is the first time temporary insanity is run as a defense. He was driven insane because the deceased was sleeping with his wife. And through that defense, and Stanton makes an argument that shooting someone sleeping with your wife is a form of self-defense, Stanton and the others get him off. Sickles spends only a handful of nights in jail and goes on to a distinguished career in the Civil War. Briefly, Stanton, this diehard Democrat, serves in a Democratic administration. During the secession winter, he serves in the administration of President Buchanan. As they're debating what to do about Fort Sumter, Stanton is firmly on the side that Buchanan must not give up the fort. He tells Buchanan to his face that if he gives up the fort, it will be just like Benedict Arnold during the Revolutionary War, and his name will go down in history with that of Benedict Arnold. He was not a man to mince words. After Lincoln takes office, Stanton is briefly, again, a private citizen. He's quite critical of Lincoln and the Lincoln administration in his private letters. In one, he writes that there was, quote, no sign of any intelligent understanding by Lincoln or the crew that groomed him of the state of the country or the exigencies of the time. Bluster and bravura alternate with timidity and despair. Recklessness and hopelessness by turns rule the hour. What but disgrace and disaster can happen? Right. Lincoln probably heard some rumors that Stanton was talking with his Democratic friends in this way, and yet, a few months later, when Lincoln needs a new Secretary of War, he turns to Stanton. Why? Well, in part it was because he was a diehard Democrat. Lincoln was looking for a way of telling the world this is not a Republican war, this is a Union war in which Democrats are welcome and indeed brought into the administration. In part, it was because Stanton already had a reputation as hardworking, determined, driven, efficient. And although Lincoln did not himself know Stanton well, he trusted the advice of his advisors who did and brought him into the cabinet in January of '62. And he soon proved his reputation right. Within the first few weeks of being Secretary of War, he got through Congress legislation to authorize the federal government to take control of the railroads and telegraphs. In theory, he could have nationalized the railroads. That wasn't what he did. What he did was bring the heads of the railroads to Washington and say, look, we're going to work together. Here's how it's going to work. If I need to, I'm going to give you orders, and you're going to implement them, and you're going to charge low rates. How does that sound? And they all nodded and said, that sounds fine, Secretary Stanton. The prime example of how Stanton used the rails and telegraphs during the war was the Tennessee troop movement. In the fall of 1863, it looked like the South would capture Chattanooga, Tennessee, along with 30,000 troops there under General William Rosecrans. And Stanton summoned Lincoln, who was out here at the soldiers' home. He brought him into the War Department and Seward and Chase and a few others, and Stanton said to them, look, there are 20,000 troops in Northern Virginia that are not doing very much. I'm going to move them in a week's time by rail to Tennessee. And Lincoln laughed. He said, Stanton, you can't get them from Northern Virginia in here to D.C. in a week's time. It's going to take you months to get them to Chattanooga. It'll be far too late. Stanton didn't have much of a sense of humor. He said the situation was too serious for jokes. And he and the others kind of worked on Lincoln a bit over some oysters after midnight, and Lincoln gave the okay. Okay, you can try it. Stanton remained in the War Department the rest of that night, and he was there for the next couple nights, sending telegrams, receiving telegrams, coordinating this massive movement of men across more than 1,200 miles, more than 6 different rail systems. They have to cross the Ohio River twice. They're at places where there are no rail bridges of the Ohio River. It is the longest, fastest, largest movement of men in history up to that point. And he succeeds. He does what he told Lincoln he could do. He gets 20,000 troops to Chattanooga in a week. They save Chattanooga, and then they become a key part of the advance on Atlanta the next year. So I could go on all night with Stanton the efficient and Stanton the diligent, but some of you are sitting saying, I want to hear about Stanton the tyrannical. So, okay. Let's talk about General William Stone, a distinguished graduate of West Point, serving in the Union Army early in the war. Not long after Stanton becomes Secretary of War, he starts hearing bad things about Stone from some Republican members of Congress. In particular, he hears that Stone bungled the Battle of Ball's Bluff just over there, and that he's in communication with rebel generals. Stanton arranges for Stone to be arrested on the streets of Washington after midnight one night and taken to a distant fort, kept in solitary confinement. Stone sends letter after letter saying, look, I'll face a court-martial. What are the charges? Stanton doesn't respond to those letters. He keeps Stone in jail for about 6 months. He finally releases him when Congress passes a law which could be summarized as Release Stone. And he finally lets him out. He doesn't even then let Stone kind of redeem his reputation on the battlefield. So another example, not quite as dark, but it bears on the impeachment story. We tend to forget that in the election of 1864, the parties were not the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. They were the Union Party and the Democratic Party. Lincoln ran as a Union candidate, and as a way of sort of making this seem more real, you know, it's not just the Republicans under another name, he selected a new running mate, a Democrat, a lifelong Democrat like Stanton, by the name of Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. Johnson had distinguished himself. Almost all the other senators from states which seceded resigned after their state seceded. Johnson didn't. He said, there are a bunch of rebels down there in Tennessee who have purported to take Tennessee out of the Union. Tennessee is part of the Union. I represent Tennessee in the United States Senate. I'm staying put. He did. Not long thereafter, when the Union gets control of a bit of Tennessee, Lincoln and Stanton send Johnson down there to Tennessee to serve as the military governor. All through the war, from the middle of '62 through his becoming vice president, Johnson reports to Stanton. There are all these telegrams back and forth on generally fairly small things, but he never sort of gives away his Democratic Party card, but he runs as a Union candidate on the Union slate. Now, Stanton's role in the election of '64, which is, some people think dark, some people think not. At the time, some states, but not all by any matter of means, allowed for what we would call absentee voting. So if the Union soldiers, who were the strongest supporters of the Union Party, were going to vote in that election, many of them had to get home. And to enable them to do that, Stanton arranged for them to have leaves, and he arranged transportation at government expense. And according to his Democratic critics, he very carefully selected the regiments which would get leave. Regiments with Democratic colonels found it difficult to get leave. Regiments with solid Republican/Union colonels, they were sent home in comfortable circumstances, and in some cases remained home for a whole month because the state elections in some critical states occurred in October and the presidential elections in November. So we tend to forget how close that election was, and Stanton played a critical role in ensuring that Lincoln was reelected. Let's talk a bit about his relationship with Lincoln itself. In some senses, they're similar. They're both lawyers from the Midwest. They are anti-slavery. They both favor enlisting blacks into the Union Army. In some sense, of course, they could not be more different. Lincoln is gracious, always ready to listen, wants to say yes when people ask him to do things. Stanton is often rude and dictatorial, and often his initial instinct is almost always to say no and then think of a reason why. There's a great scene in the Lincoln movie that captures this. They're in Stanton's telegraph office. Lincoln is sitting sort of down. There are a couple of folks around, and Stanton looks at him and says, "You're going to tell one of your stories." "I don't have time for one of your stories, Mr. President." And then he spins around to his aide and says, "Where are those Tennessee troop numbers?" You know, and I think that's about right. He was rude even to Abraham Lincoln, but they work well together. Lincoln, you know, he knows that Stanton is rude and dictatorial and even tyrannical, but he needs a tough guy, and Stanton serves that purpose well. Not long after Lincoln died, his private secretary, John Hay, writes a letter to Stanton and says that, you know, not everyone knows, as I do, how close you stood to our lost leader, how he loved you and trusted you, and how vain were all efforts to shake that trust and confidence not lightly given and never withdrawn. So let's turn to April 14th, 1865, the night Lincoln is shot. Stanton is at home, and a messenger arrives breathless on foot and says, "Lincoln has been shot and Seward has been stabbed." And Stanton doesn't believe it. He was just with Seward a couple hours back. And he said, so he goes first to the Seward house, where he finds Seward on his bed, soaked in blood. An assassin has sort of slashed Seward's face with a knife. He learns that Seward will survive, and he hastens to Lincoln's side at the Peterson house, where he learns from the doctors that Lincoln will not survive. So he doesn't linger with Lincoln in the back bedroom and with the doctors. He goes to the next room to a table about this size, and he sits down and he goes to work. He starts working to figure out who shot the president and who slashed Seward. He goes to work finding those people. He issues orders to close the bridges out of Washington, to interview and, if necessary, arrest those who are leaving Washington. He starts interviewing witnesses. He's a lawyer. He knows that witnesses tend to forget. So he brings some of the witnesses, and when it proves difficult to take notes longhand, he sends an aide out to find someone who can take shorthand. And he sends reports to the nation. The nation learns of the attacks on Lincoln and Seward through Stanton's reports to the press, which he sits at that little table and scribbles on the telegraph pad, and then sends to, has an aide run them to the War Department to put on the telegraph, first to New York and then around the nation. The next morning, right after Lincoln dies, Stanton supposedly says, now he belongs to the ages. I say supposedly because the first time that appears in print is 25 years later. And if you think back to things that happened 25 years ago, well, you're not quite so sure. And when you look at the accounts that appeared in the newspapers here and in New York and in letters, you know, in the days immediately after Lincoln's death, they were actually pretty clear about what happened right after Lincoln's death, namely that Lincoln's pastor, who was in the room, said, "Let us pray," and that everyone in the room gathered in prayer over the body of their deceased president and friend, weeping, and that when that was over, people left. So sadly, I believe that this one quote, for which Stanton makes it into Bartlett's familiar quotations, he didn't say. Johnson asked everyone who was in the cabinet to remain, and so Stanton remains along with others. Among his first tasks is the manhunt and the trial of the Lincoln conspirators. One of the great documents I found was Stanton's handwritten procedures for how that trial was to be run. He wanted a secret trial. He wanted the attorneys to take an oath that they had been loyal to the Union. But he continues to run the War Department, which means shrinking the War Department, kind of transforming the Army into an occupation army. He gets along well with Johnson at first. Indeed, it's amazing to read the newspapers of late '65 because everyone loves Andrew Johnson, this president whom we all think of as kind of way down there on the lowest end of the presidential list, was popular, North and South, Democratic and Republican. It's not till early '66 when Johnson vetoes first the Freedmen's Act bill and then the Civil Rights bill that a split emerges between Johnson and the Republicans, and Stanton is firmly in the camp of the Republicans. As I mentioned at the outset, he's concerned about violence in the South. He's concerned because the telegraphs reach him. So in July of '65, he has a telegraph from Vicksburg, Mississippi, reporting on the murder of a black by a white there, and Stanton sends out a message. He directs the local commander to arrest and hold the accused and try him by military commissions. You know, military commissions are not new. Stanton made extensive use of them during the Civil War. Cause him to be tried before a military commission and carry its sentence into effect. If any effort should be made to release him by habeas corpus, you are directed to disobey the writ and to arrest the person issuing it or attempting to execute it. So if you think about that for a moment, Stanton is telling the general that if some Mississippi state judge purports to issue a writ of habeas corpus for this prisoner, arrest the judge and arrest the marshal for good measure. Very soon, a disagreement develops between Stanton and Johnson over this kind of issue. And Johnson believes the Army should get out, the war is over. Stanton insists that they should remain. Johnson wants to get Stanton out. But Congress complicated Johnson's life by passing the Tenure of Office Act, which provided that if for generally every appointment that required Senate consent, that appointee could not be removed without Senate consent. So in essence, kind of creating a two-way Senate consent process, both for the appointment and the removal. And when this bill was merely a bill and Johnson was discussing with his cabinet whether he should sign it or veto it, Stanton joined the others in advising that this was unconstitutional. It was an improper limit on the president's right to appoint who he wanted. And most modern legal scholars would agree with Johnson and Stanton on this point. So Johnson arguably did the right thing in vetoing the bill, but Johnson didn't have the votes at this point. Congress passed the bill into law over Johnson's veto. That happened a lot to Andrew Johnson. In the summer of '67, while with Congress out of Washington, Johnson wrote to Stanton that, quote, "Public considerations of a high character constrain me to say that your resignation as Secretary of War will be accepted." And Stanton comes back within the hour. "Public considerations of a high character, which alone have induced me to remain at the head of the War Department, constrain me not to resign the office of Secretary of War before the next meeting of Congress." Strong up in New York wrote that war to the knife has seldom been declared with such brevity and wit. He thought it was really quite good. The Republican newspapers sided with Stanton. Several of them said that Stanton, should not leave office until Johnson was out of office, whether by death or impeachment or a new election. So Johnson went back to his office and studied the Tenure of Office Act, and he found a loophole. When Congress was out of session, the act allowed him to suspend an official and appoint an interim. And so he decides to do this. He suspends Stanton and appoints Ulysses Grant as the interim Secretary of War. And then, as required by the statute, when Congress returned in December, Johnson provided them the details of why he had suspended Stanton and why he believed that Stanton was an inappropriate Secretary of War. And Stanton, the suspended secretary, helped his Republican friends in Congress draft the response, the sort of point-by-point, no, Johnson has it wrong for these reasons. And first the committee and then the whole Senate agreed, and they voted to reinstate Stanton as Secretary of War. So Johnson, thinking, oh, I've gotten rid of him, now he's back. And Johnson had hoped that Grant would kind of stay on for a few hours so that he might appoint another interim or he might file a court case, but no, Grant, probably advised of the legal situation by Stanton, kind of the moment he hears that Stanton has been reinstated, he hands Stanton the keys and goes back to the safety of his office across the street as general in charge. So after a couple more weeks of this, on the 21st of February, a senior official of the War Department shows up in Stanton's office, Lorenzo Thomas, and says, with letters from President Johnson, appointing him as the new Secretary of War. And Stanton, instructions for Stanton to clear out. And Stanton says, well, I want to think about this for a few hours, and Thomas foolishly goes away and says, okay. Stanton immediately sends telegraphs to his friends up on Capitol Hill, and all hell breaks loose up on Capitol Hill. They drop what they're doing. The House begins debating whether to impeach Johnson. The Senate begins debating its own resolution. And there's a flurry of messages back and forth between Stanton with some great messages, including Senator Howard saying, if force is employed against you, repel it. Stand firm, exclamation point. And an even more pointed one from Senator Sumner, just one word, stick. It seemed, they're talking war up on Capitol Hill. That seemed actually quite possible. It seemed that there might be clashes between troops loyal to Stanton and troops loyal to Thomas. Stanton spent that night in the War Department. And Thomas was out drinking and bragging that the next morning he was going to go to the War Department and take control. No, Stanton was not out drinking. He was working. He was working on a criminal complaint against Thomas for violation of the Tenure of Office Act. And when he had that finished, his friend, the local judge, just happened to be at the War Department. Conveniently, he signed the affidavit. The judge issued the orders to arrest Thomas. Thomas was arrested the next morning at dawn, dragged into court, made bail, released, and then Thomas, tired and hungry and hungover, shows up at the War Department. And then a little scene ensues in which Thomas says, I am the Secretary of War, and I order you to leave. And Stanton says, I am the Secretary of War. You are merely the Adjutant General. Go back to your office and do your work. Back and forth. They go into an adjoining office, so there's not quite such a crowd. And Thomas says to Stanton, the next time you have me arrested, can you please do it after I have had something to eat? And Stanton says to one of the aides, George, you have a bottle in here somewhere. Can you find it? And he pours a drink for each of them and lifts it and says, now at least we're on level ground. And then he turns to Thomas and says, where's that report on the cemeteries that you owe me? Thomas leaves the War Department beaten for the time being. Yes, I know. And on this same day, the House votes by an overwhelming margin to impeach Andrew Johnson. And then, as those of you who've been through impeachment remember, the action turns to the Senate, which has to try the president and has to, for the first time really in American history, wrestle with the question of what those words in the Constitution mean. What exactly are high crimes and misdemeanors that are sufficient to justify removing an American president? It goes on for weeks and weeks. Lawyers. Future President James Garfield writes home that Washington is drowning in a sea of words. And Stanton, through this whole thing, is holed up at the War Department. He's not inactive. He's actively helping his friends on Capitol Hill to further the effort to remove Johnson. So, for example, when Benjamin Butler, who's the lead lawyer for the House in trying to impeach and remove Johnson, needs some clerical help, they want to compile a list of all the positions covered by the Tenure of Office Act. He sends a message to Stanton and says, look, can you have your clerks do it? And Stanton has his clerks work through the weekend to compile the list. He's not troubled by the fact that these are federal employees and he's putting them to work to remove the federal president. No, he thinks that Johnson is a tyrant who needs to be removed. But, as most of you know, that isn't what happens. In the end, Johnson survives by one vote. If one more senator had changed his mind and voted to convict and remove, Johnson would have been convicted and removed, and President pro tem of the Senate would have become president for at least a few months. And on that day, the day of the final vote, there were a couple of votes, but on the day of the final vote in the Senate, when it was clear that Johnson would survive, Stanton leaves the War Department. He doesn't actually file a resignation letter. He just sends a note saying, I've left the keys with my aide. And as best I can tell, Stanton never visits the War Department again in the rest of his life. This building where he had spent 6 dramatic years, his health is not good. In the fall of '68, he's once again on the campaign trail, campaigning for Ulysses Grant, arguing that, just as in the election of '64, the voters had rallied round the flag for Lincoln and Johnson, that the voters should now rally round the flag for Grant and his running mate. Grant wins. Stanton sort of expects to be rewarded in the way in which 19th century presidents rewarded key people with an appointment, perhaps back to the War Department, perhaps to the Supreme Court. It doesn't happen, or it at least doesn't happen very rapidly. It isn't until December of '69 that, with a little bit of nudging from some of Stanton's friends in Congress, that Ulysses Grant sends a nomination up to Capitol Hill to nominate Stanton for a seat on the Supreme Court that will become vacant in a couple weeks. And in those halcyon days, the Senate confirmed the nomination the very same day, and the papers come to Stanton. He writes a lovely thank you letter to Ulysses Grant, but he never serves on the Supreme Court. He dies 2 days later. Yeah. He's 55 years old. He basically worked himself to death during the Civil War. Had asthma and congestive heart failure, but really overwork. So that is a brief summary of a long book. Hopefully, though, it will entice you to buy and read. But we've got 2 microphones here, and we've got all sorts of political types who must have questions. You're first.
Sure. Thanks very much for coming out tonight. I'm fascinated by the fact that Stanton was nominated to the Supreme Court so soon before his death. I guess my question is, what do you think the nation lost by being deprived of the perspective of someone who had been intimately involved in military Reconstruction? How might his voice have shaped what the court did?
Well, I think Stanton would have been a strong vote for, how to put it, kind of the things that occurred during the war. His good pal Salmon Chase, actually, who was the Treasury Secretary during the war, actually then as Supreme Court Justice votes to overturn one of the measures that Chase himself had pushed through, the Legal Tender Act. I do not think Stanton would have done that. He would have voted kind of down the line for Lincoln's war measures, and he would have voted kind of consistently, how to put it, in favor of blacks and civil rights, again, in a way that, it's hard with a Supreme Court of 9 people. It's always hard to say, that one person would have changed that case. But I think he would have been a good justice. I don't think he would have been a great justice, but I think he would have been a good justice, firm, for Lincoln's policies and for civil rights. So, yes.
I wonder if you could explain to us the relationship he had with the other cabinet officers, much like Doris, Kearns, Goodwin did in Team of Rivals.
I see my research assistant Nora back there smiling. She spent a lot of time working on the relationship between Stanton and Salmon Chase. I mean, some of these people he had known for a long time. So Stanton and Salmon Chase went back 20 years. They had been close friends and colleagues in Ohio. Stanton had known Seward for a good 15 years. They had corresponded on political topics. But once Stanton is in the War Department, he takes a very expansive definition of his jurisdiction, right? So we're in the midst of a war, so really everything belongs to the War Department, right? If there's a foreign policy issue that might impede the war effort, well, I should have first dibs on that, not my friend Seward. Or, you know, I need money to run the war effort. And so he's continually writing rather harsh messages to his longtime close friend Chase. And I haven't even gotten to the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. Gideon Welles, every night here in Washington, writes in his diary. And almost every night, Gideon Welles is writing, once again, Stanton has shown himself deceitful and, dishonest. I mean, I made, sort of cut and paste quotations from the Gideon Welles diary about Stanton. And I realized I could publish a whole book just of, Gideon Welles dislikes Edwin Stanton. So he did not get on well with his cabinet colleagues. They resented his sort of expansive notion of the War Department's jurisdiction. They resented his close relationship with Lincoln. It not infrequently happened that the cabinet would be sitting around Lincoln's table. There was no cabinet room per se. It was basically just Lincoln's office. And so they would be gathered for the regular session of the cabinet, and Stanton and Lincoln would stroll in from the War Department telegraph office, and the other cabinet members would sort of sigh because they knew that whatever issue they were going to discuss, Lincoln and Stanton had more or less decided in their little stroll from the War Department to the White House. So, yes.
This is a subject I don't know a whole lot about, but what was the relationship between Stanton and Grant? Because Grant worked for Stanton.
Correct. So what? And so there's this sort of, he worked for Stanton. Stanton did not know Grant before the war. He sort of first meets him basically by reading reports of Grant's victories. Indeed, one of the first kind of general messages that Stanton sends out is Grant won a victory at Fort Donelson in early '62, and some of the newspapers kind of gave Stanton credit, and he wrote a wonderful note to the New York Tribune saying, look, it's not my credit. It's the generals, it's the soldiers, it's the spirit of the Lord that moved the men as in the days of Joshua, and that became known as his Days of Joshua letter. But he liked what he saw of Grant, and he helped to promote Grant to the position, and indeed, when Grant was given command of the West, Stanton went out personally to hand Grant the papers to promote him. I think he wanted to just lay eyes on this Ulysses Grant. They spent a couple days together. They met in Indianapolis and went down south. And then they did work incredibly closely together during the Reconstruction years. This is not to say that there were not some tensions. Grant resented the way that even after the war, Stanton would occasionally send messages directly to generals rather than going through Grant, which was the proper procedure. But Stanton was completely, committed to Grant's candidacy to become president in '68. He was 100% behind Grant as the next president of the United States to succeed Johnson.
And they had the same position on Reconstruction.
Largely the same position on Reconstruction. They both felt that it was too soon to just pull the army out of the South and leave the Southerners. When Johnson said, well, we want to let Southerners govern Southerners, you have to understand what he meant was white Southerners to govern all Southerners.
Right.
And this was at a time when we had our first black congressman coming in. And moreover, from Stanton's perspective, the most worrisome thing was the ongoing racial violence. And he felt that it was just imperative. And Grant agreed with that. He felt the Army needed to remain for a while, not forever, but for a while, to ensure peace. So.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
This is my own lack of knowledge, but when you describe Stanton as an anti-slavery Democrat in the 1850s, that's not a category.
Not a well-known category.
That is not a
yes.
well-known category, and I find it interesting, both the concept of an anti-slavery Democrat in a Democratic administration in which there are not many anti-slavery Democrats.
Indeed.
And then an anti-slavery Democrat aligned with the radical Republicans.
Right.
That is not a.
Can
you talk about that?
Yeah. So I think we too easily sort of think, oh, the Democrats were basically supportive of the South, so even the Northern Democrats were supportive of slavery. No, there were a lot of Northern anti-slavery Democrats. Now, some of them, when the Republican Party is formed in 1856, migrate into the Republican Party. Salmon Chase would be a good example of that. He ran, when he became governor of Ohio in the early 1850s, he ran as an anti-slavery Democrat. But when the Republican Party was formed, okay, I'm now a Republican. But there were kind of right up until the Civil War, Democrats who had a variety of views on slavery. As indicated, think about the 1860 election. There are two Democratic candidates in the 1860 election, the Southern Democrat and the Northern Democrat, Stephen Douglas, who has this notion of popular sovereignty, which the Southerners view, I mean, for Southerners, Stephen Douglas is just sort of an abolitionist, pretending to be a Democrat. So there's a wide variety of views on slavery. Now, when I call Stanton an anti-slavery Democrat, he doesn't get quite full marks on that score because his anti-slavery comments tend to be private. And there are reliable reports that when he was hanging out with Southern slave-owning Democrats, that he would make jokes at the expense of abolitionists and say that those abolitionists want to tear up the Constitution. So he's a little bit of a chameleon on this issue. He's not as publicly anti-slavery as, say, Salmon Chase. But certainly in his correspondence with Chase, he sounds very anti-slavery, going back not just in the 1850s, but into the 1840s. Bill.
It has occurred to me in absorbing this book and reflecting on the fact that the general history of the Civil War is that because of leadership advantages and strategic advantages, the Southerners managed to continue the war perhaps much longer than it should have been continued if you look at the relative resources. That you have a man in Stanton whose biggest thing was this litigation on the Wheeling Bridge, who comes into office as Secretary of War. By 1865, he is organizing all the assassination. The learning experience by having to run the war greatly improved the skill set that was necessary to both win the war and achieve he grew in that office tremendously.
Yes. I mean, when he first arrives, he hasn't administered a large organization, and suddenly he has this large War Department, which has grown very rapidly, and thus there are strains. And he has an army of about 750,000 men. And so there's just a very steep learning curve. But one point on which his friends and his enemies agreed was that the man was tireless. One lawyer who worked with him on a case in Pittsburgh said, I've worked with smarter men, I've worked with nicer men, but I have never worked with a man who could apply himself as hard for as long as Stanton. And he certainly does that in the War Department, so that even by the end of 62, when he's only been in office for a year, he's noticeably better at his job than he was on the day he arrived. By the end of 64, he is dramatically better at his job than he was in 62. what would have happened if Stanton had never been Secretary of War? Would the North have won? Yes, the North would ultimately have pulled it together and won the war. But I think it would have taken longer, and it would have cost more, both in lives and dollars, because Stanton and his team were so good at what they eventually did. So, yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to tell you that I've read your first 2 books, and you're a wonderful writer. Thank you so much.
Wonderful to hear.
I'm also interested.
I should mention, by the by, that they do have copies of Seward on sale, and that literally today, it was out of print briefly, but John Jay is back in print, and they will happily take orders for John Jay back in print.
I also wanted to know what got you interested in the Civil War era.
Well, I suspect many of you have read Doris Kearns Goodwin's wonderful book on the team of rivals, and I read that book not long after my Jay book was published, and I loved that book, particularly the way in which she used some voices that were unfamiliar, you know, the diary of Fanny Seward, Seward's teenage daughter, and the letters of Kate Chase, Chase's daughter, and, you know, other women and less-known figures that she sort of draws into the conversation, if you will, about Lincoln and his cabinet. And I was particularly taken with Seward. I mean, there's this wonderful guy, you know, he's funny, and he's, you know, he loves life, and he's had this long and interesting life. He's been the governor of New York, and he's been a senator for 12 years, and then he becomes the Secretary of State. And I felt like, although she did a good job with Seward, that there was more, that as a lawyer that I might do more with his legal career, and that I might do more with what happens after Lincoln's death, because her book ends with Lincoln's death, and Seward lives on for another 7 years, and he does arguably the most important thing he ever does in that period. He buys Alaska, right? I mean, that's what everyone knows about the guy. So I thought that there was a good book to write about Seward, and my agent and my publisher agreed, and so I wrote that. And Stanton a little bit similarly. You know, a little bit darker figure, not quite as fun to have at the dinner table, but important and interesting, and so I thought I would tackle him. And I probably am. I love this period of American history. I will probably stick with it for my next go-round as well. I hope to be back here in a couple of years. So. One more. Oh, Larry.
Yes. I have a question for you, not about history.
Okay.
But it's about an attribute of Stanton's you mentioned a moment ago, his hard-working nature. And that is something that just screams out at you from the book. I mean, this is the most hardest-working, most driven person I have ever read about. And I'm wondering, I mean, obviously, among his many attributes, so this is, I guess, a positive attribute, although maybe he goes overboard a bit at times. But do you have any views as to
where it comes from?
Yes.
Where it comes from. Well, I think it comes really probably at the moment when his father passes away. He is 13 years old, and his father leaves nothing. I mean, his mother, at one point, in desperation, puts an ad in the local newspaper saying that she's going to run a store in their front parlor. Now, that doesn't last for very long, but she puts both Stanton and his brother Darwin to work. And, you know, the family sort of scrapes and survives. So, you know, a lot of folks who come from very, you know, I mean, you get going at a rapid pace, and then you just keep going. And so, you know, he had to work hard. I mean, even, you know, as a 13-year-old boy in that bookstore, he was basically working the job and educating himself at the same time. I mean, the reason that he was not a great clerk in the bookstore was that he was reading serious books to educate himself, you know, basically through what we would think of as the high school years. And then he goes off to Kenyon College and kind of works for, you know, we would say works his way through college, but he can't even work his way through college. There's so little money. So I think it's really in that period of his kind of teenage years of I don't want to say abject poverty. They didn't starve, but it was pretty grim. And And I suppose the other thing is, when you get to the war years, there's a sense that it is just so important that you cannot let your personal life get in the way of what you were doing at the office. So, you know, he really is not very attentive to his wife and his children during the war years. He spends many a night on that sort of ratty couch in the War Department telegraph office because something is going on in Mississippi or Georgia or wherever that he needs as best he can to keep in telegraphic touch with. You know, at one point he said in a letter to a friend that, you know, he felt he needed to be, during these war years, as pure as a priest before the altar, that nothing personal should get in the way of what he was doing to save the Union. So that's about as well as I can do with that. All right, we will declare it over. I will sign books.